Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this very special gender webinar. Today we have with us Professors Joshua Castellino, Professor Sarah Bradshaw, our Human Rights Course team faculty, and we have a guest speaker, Ms. Magali, who is an urban scholar and an expert from Middlesex University, and one of her research focus has also been gender. And thank you, Magali, for joining us today. And welcome back, Sarah and Joshua. Welcome to the third webinar.
Thank you.
Wow, we already have some questions coming in. So thank you, everybody who has been tuned in. And I think we'd like to start immediately with a question that has been posted on the forum. This is a question which takes off from where we stopped our webinar from last time, which is that regarding gender awareness, do we have any practical examples of where we see school textbooks and the literature that starts from an early age being edited and reviewed so that it actually promotes gender neutrality and awareness and actually doesn't have this language of discrimination?
Magali, I think you had some. You wanted to start with that.
I thought it was an interesting question because a lot of the debates at the moment raise a lot of issues, but then what do we do next? What kind of policies can we implement to make a change? And thinking about education sounds like a good avenue. However, I just thought about an example. It was, I think, about 2 or 3 years ago in France, where they introduced, because France takes its time on these questions, the notion of gender in the curriculum. So, and not just sexuality and sex, but gender, but it had a strong opposition. So a visible opposition that took up to the streets in high numbers. There were demonstrations, there were media outcry to the introduction of gender, that we were going to talk about gender fluidity, non-binary, all of these questions that were going to be introduced to the curriculum were taken up by a more far-right or more conservative fringe of French society and used as a political tool to demonstrate against other particular issues. But it took quite a big proportion in terms of reception. So interestingly enough, I think it is important. It's just, I think it depends on the context and how it's being approached.
Did they achieve it in the end? Did they get gender into the text?
It has been added into the textbook, yeah.
Because my example would be exactly like yours. I was in Nicaragua when they tried to introduce sexual rights into curriculum, and that was blocked completely. Okay. And they actually had textbooks already printed, ready to go to the schools, and that was the church that actually blocked that. So they were all printed, ready to go, and then they were all withdrawn. So again, I think it is incredibly important, but getting it actually onto the curriculum meets with so much opposition, which is really interesting, particularly for gender. I mean, what is that opposition?
It does seem like there's a direct correlation as well between how conservative society is and how willing it is to accept any repositioning, shall we say, of knowledge on this. But I think that's Bushra's question, isn't it, today? I think it's a really good question in terms of so many different issues, because obviously starting the ball rolling in that education context early, in which you can achieve this kind of long-term sustained societal change that we need. I know in Japan there was some discussion, not just around gender primarily, but also around Burakumin and Ainu, indigenous peoples in Japan, and the portrayal of Korean women. As you know, Japanese history on this one is that these used to be called Korean comfort women. The name suggests, again, I think what it really is, these were women who were captured and held in captivity to, in inverted commas, service the Japanese Imperial Army. And there was some discussion there about the extent to which even their portrayal, in the way in which they were portrayed, needed to be changed. And I know there was a discussion. Japan is a conservative society on these issues, so these discussions happen. I mean, I don't know if viewers are aware about the vote in Australia yesterday on gay rights and the extent to gay marriage and the extent to which that will, to really solidify a change like that. You know, yes, there has to be legislation, but it has to find its way into textbooks. It has to find its way, and that means really challenging received wisdom.
it was 60% in favour, wasn't it? So you still got 40%. Quite, that's quite a sizable percentage of the population that still are against same-sex marriage, which is how do you change that attitude? Hopefully, it isn't going to mean that the world as we know it suddenly changes or ends. And I suppose once you've got some legislation, actually seen that.
Yeah, but from our perspective, the world as we know it, many things can change. Actually, we're quite happy for many of those things to go. So.
Thank you. May I request Magali and Sarah to just speak a bit louder? My apologies. We missed a little bit out there. While we're on this fantastic discussion about gender, we have a very interesting question that's just come in from Reggie Salonka, which is a live question. And he's asked, what would be the involvement and role of men in gender mainstreaming?
Great question.
Okay. Can I go?
Yeah,
please.
Okay, it's funny, I had a class last week with my third-year students, and we were talking, or a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the role of men, and can men be feminists? And there's this whole issue around where men fit, particularly in the feminist movement, about you can be an ally, but can you be a feminist, and what is the role of men? And I think one thing I found quite interesting, I know we're going to move on to talk about the #MeToo, but the way that, in many ways, that's also put a focus onto men. And some men, when they're sort of apologizing for their actions, are really going, well, look at me, and moving the focus to them and away from the women. So you've got, even when men are apologizing on that, we've actually seen how they actually shift it to actually center on them. And I think that's one of the issues many feminists have with men's involvement in gender issues, is how sometimes it can then shift to the masculinity, to the man themselves, and away from the women. And I think that's what we really have to make sure that men's involvement, I'm not obviously suggesting all men would do that, but we do see that happen. Maybe I don't know what your experience is.
No, it's obviously it's a controversial question amongst various feminist circles whether a man can be feminist. I think I have my own stand on that, but I think it's not, like you said, it's not by being in opposition to them and their participation in the feminist debate, but it's in the way that they engage with that discussion and that debate that doesn't then center the debate on them. It can't be.
Yeah, but I mean, male allies are so important, and particularly male allies that are in positions of power within industries and including education, for example. I mean, it's lovely to have more women in positions of power, but that doesn't mean that they're gendered or feminists. A person's a person in that sense, and they promote it in different ways. So having men in positions of power in management who are allies is absolutely an excellent way to. I'm looking at Joshua there. He's a good example of as actually being someone who actually, will support female colleagues, etc. That's really important.
But there is also the fact that there are some issues that are even more crucial for men to be involved in, like domestic violence. I mean, there's very often, you don't want to stereotype it, but very often domestic violence tends to occur by men against women. So that tends to, you can't solve that problem without having direct interchange, exchange, convincing, persuasion, compelling of men's behavior. There are other issues that are collective that need to be solved, and there are other issues that need much more of a female insight into. So I think you can't solve. But for instance, the White Ribbons campaign in the United States of America on domestic violence, which was all about men's involvement in terms of combating domestic violence, was an important one. But that's not the only issue with regards to some of these challenges.
I don't know if you want to.
Not on that. I have another point I'll pick up on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just come back to this. That when we're looking at violence against women and gender-based violence, then we've got to look at it as a structural issue. And again, sometimes it's come back to individual men going off and receiving treatment. But what we also need to look at those structures, those institutions that institutionalize discrimination and allow this violence to occur. And we're back to the education, the changing attitudes, which is so important for men and for women, around that, around what that means.
I think on that point, a big issue with all the discussions that we have today is power. We started to discuss that, and we think of power not just as this one directional process, but much more pervasive that takes different forms. And happens in different spaces of society. And one way to look at it is how we change mentalities, and through education primarily to allow those different forms, they're much more banal forms of power relations that we can question. And in there, the role of men can be much more on a micro level, where I think in discussion with feminism, they can also partake at a micro level with other men in that discussion and progress the debate. Something more banal, much more everyday, where their role can matter.
I think my mind has flipped to the P word, patriarchy. And patriarchy, we look at patriarchy, we're looking at relationships of power between men as well as male and female. And if we bring back to the fore that word patriarchy, which I know some people, I mean, it's controversial in terms of its how we define it and its meaning, but I think it's actually a really important word to put back on the table and really restart that conversation around that and what it means. It's all about power.
Yeah, it's not archaic.
Thank you. While we're on this question of patriarchy and, of course, gender and the role of men, there's a question that's come in, and actually I want to link this to the role of men's rights as well. Kanan R. Nair has asked, what's the role of culture and religion in gender mainstreaming? I want to extend it to this point in which, is patriarchy even institutionalized structurally in terms of not just law, but also culture and religion? And do we see that as a combative approach to rectify this error, or do we just see it as something as it is?
Sarah, you want to start with that?
Well, patriarchy, yes. I mean, patriarchal institutions, all our institutions, when we think about them, are reinforced patriarchy. So we can talk about culture, we can talk about religion, we can talk about education, but then we can also talk about ourselves on our day-to-day basis. And the notion of formativity in gender is very much around how we produce and reproduce, and we can therefore make gender fluidity, or we can reconstruct binaries and relations of power. So I think when we talk about patriarchy, we don't need to get too hung up on this institution or that institution. We've got to understand it's this overarching paradigm, this big bubble within which we all operate that we often don't think about because of that. Because it's like the dominant paradigm of capitalism or neoliberalism, we don't really think about it on a day-to-day basis, but we all live it, and therefore that's what makes it so problematic to try and work through
and challenge and question it, and therefore do not accept it as this is the situation and we ought to go with the consensus. But it's more difficult when it is a little bit more stealth and a bit more underlying in society, and those forms of reproduction and social reproduction are, and we partake in it as well.
But I mean, I guess culture, and this is the extension to the question that you put traditionally, where culture and religion are the classic ones through which that is extended, and the classic ones through which that's justified. And I always put it to my class when I'm talking about this issue. I say, why do we think culture is static? So we essentially believe that culture is static. So we reinforce something that was a reality, a structured, a gendered reality, and an ungendered reality from 7, 8, 9, 10 centuries ago, when we were perhaps in a very different setup. We wrote stuff down. We decided those were going to be the rules. We then followed those rules, and maybe at the time in which those rules were framed, I doubt it, but maybe at the time in which those rules were framed, there was some legitimacy to them. But to blindly follow them century after century on the grounds that they are somehow some reflection of culture seems to suggest that a basic lack of awareness of culture. Culture has always been transient and dynamic. And the culture that gender discrimination for me is based on is a culture of domination by men over women. That's the cultural problem.
I think the problem is also that people see culture as just existing out there and forget that actually we constructed it. It's not something natural, but it almost becomes something natural or nature given or God given, and therefore it's somehow something we can't acknowledge, which is why we move from sex to gender to try and get away from that static notion to this more dynamic notion, and dynamic notions are important because they suggest change.
But I've always found it strange that we're willing to accept so much change in culture in so many different parts of our lives. We're willing to accept the change in terms of how we travel. We're willing to accept the change in terms of how we make money. We're trying to we accept the change in terms of you know, for instance, in this mechanism, but you know, there used to be people who believed if you cross the Great Ocean, you are now deemed, you are definitely going to hell, because there's no way you could cross Kalapani. Now we're willing to go to Mars with it, and we can accept that change. But on gender, well, that's different, because apparently that has been mandated.
But that's about power.
It is about power.
It's all about power, and it's about those who have power don't want to lose that power. And it's men, and it's also some certain women gain power from the patriarchal system also.
The game there. Yeah. But I think it's often, I understand the question and the importance of culture and religion, but I think it's often put forward at the expense of other social factors like gender and class, often in this section that again reinforces the discussion around power. But culture and religion a bit too much at the forefront of explanation.
Yeah, it moves us away from our everyday activities. Because then we can say, oh, it's a cultural thing, it's a religious thing, but we make the culture, we make the religion, and therefore we need to look at what we do in order to produce and reproduce those. And that's, like you say, moves it away from it.
There was a sub-theme to the question there as well, as to what is the best way to combat it. And I mean, do you combat it in a very aggressive, in-your-face, your culture is wrong, your religion is wrong, change it way? Or do you start finding ways within? And I'm curious to know, for instance, you know, this area of female genital mutilation in Kenya was one of these arguments that's quite a lot in the literature. And for those of you who are interested in this, we can give you links to it. But this idea in the women's movement in Kenya saying, you know, that the female genital mutilation, the actual cut, the actual violence against women that occurs needs to be stopped. But the actual transitory process of the coming into age of womanhood needs to be maintained. And there was some scholarly debate and some practitioner debate about whether you maintain the practice minus the violence or whether you don't. And I wondered what your views on that were.
It's interesting. I was just, as we were having this discussion, thinking about FGM and the debate. And yesterday, of all places in the Evening Standard, there was an article by a young Somali origin who works for the Women Equality Party, and was speaking in favor of brother membership to the Conservative Party, saying that we shouldn't assume that Labour ought to be the party of Black and ethnic minority in the UK, but she herself has worked much more closely with the Conservative. It's Russian, I'm not saying, but she said she's worked much more closely with the Conservative Party because of their stance on FGM, which has been much stronger and in line with our own activism against it than the Labour Party, which has responded a little more carefully around cultural aspects of it. And it was our stance was that gender and violence against women should prevail over in the debate.
I think that's quite interesting that Joshua has made it a violence issue, which I think if you make FGM as violence, then it changes the discourse and then much more able to get agreement. And then, as you say, sometimes when we are looking to gender mainstream or challenge, then we do have to be in bed with people that we might not normally be politically speaking in order to bring change. Probably a bad expression to use.
Probably in a gender one, yes.
While we're discussing this, there's actually a lovely comment that has come in from Rashida, who is tuning in from India, who said that such age-old gender practices are under the guise of culture and religion, and they're difficult to change because of the hold of the priestly class, and also backed by vote bank politics, which I think you were just discussing even in your example right now, Magali, with the case in the UK, which while we don't have a priestly class, we do see the conservative elements and we do see vote bank politics. Joshua, on your point of the fact that we look at a practice as violence and that changes the discourse. Joshua and Sarah, both of you were just briefly discussing about this. I'm wondering, what can we do to remedy this? This is also in connection to Ms. Sunita's question, where she says that have there been some tools, some activities, any measures that has been taken by all countries that have actually been effective towards eliminating this form of violence? And do we first recognize this as a discriminatory practice?
I mean, the answer in law, and this is where Sarah and I are going to have our regular tussle on this question, but the answer in law is that there is a very clear standard. And those of you who are interested in this, I would draw your attention to the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. First of all, please note the title. It's the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, not the gradual realization of it, the modification of it, the better progress, the progressive realization. It's the elimination. And then the key article there is Article 2G, I believe, or 2F. I'm beginning to forget. I'm beginning to lose my memory and precision here. But it says very clearly that states shall abolish any custom or practice that impacts the equal enjoyment of rights between women and men. Again, it says very clearly, there's no sitting on the fence here. You will abolish it. Now, those of you who are looking for examples on that, the CEDAW, the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, as you know, every 4 years do a review of states on how it is they are performing against these various different strictures. And you will find some elements, but I would say the elements you find are about improvements, not about elimination. Elimination, to be able to really tackle elimination for me, you've got to tackle access of women to key resources: finance, land, education. Education, actually, we do better on than many others. Finance and land, way behind. Nationality in some contexts. Women can't pass nationality on. So there are major, major challenges. There are some successes. I don't want to paint it as being doom and gloom, but certainly from the international legal perspective that Sarah has scant regard for, despite my attempt at trying to convert her into it, there is a very clear standard there, and states gradually are arriving at that standard. But remember, gradually isn't good enough. It's got to be eliminated. It's got to be now.
Remind me again when CEDAW was enacted.
1979.
1979. So how many years is that we've of all forms of discrimination against women on the table?
Yeah.
And of course, gradual. This is very, very gradual, and as we were
very
saying,
gradual.
very gradual.
Sometimes barely discernible.
Exactly. Sometimes, and in fact, we might actually be looking that we're going backwards
in some
on
places.
some of these cases, particularly when we're looking at violence against women. And it's not just more reporting, but we are seeing more and different forms of violence against women in various societies. So the laws there, and as we know, laws mean nothing unless they're enacted, and more importantly, unless people know about them, believe in them, and change their attitudes to actually put them into practice. So we're back there at the place again, that yes, it's there. And sometimes having the law means that people say, well, you've got the law, what's your problem? Yeah. And it actually being on the table means that it allows us not to talk about it. Well, we have the law, we have the right, you have the right. So what more do you want?
I mean, the short answer to that question, and I'd love to hear what Magali is saying, I think that we would agree on is, are there examples of eliminating? I think the answer, if there are, they're very few and scant. There are gradual progressions. Some of the discussions on women in boardrooms in Scandinavia are as much part of those discussions as basic access to education and water and in other places. Questions on access to finance, I think, are much further behind. Much more work needs to be done there. And some places like Lebanon, even questions of basic access to nationality laws are a major issue. But I don't know, Magali, how you see this.
Well, I'm not too familiar with the legal aspect, but I would agree with the fact that if in the debate about, if we have gained this legal rights, then that's it, that we have the solution. But it is not, because again, it's pervasive in so many elements of our everyday lives and social groups that a lot more needs to be done.
Yeah, and so it can actually work. And I think the word elimination is actually one of those. I mean, I would say to my students when I talk about the SDGs, can you imagine when it says ends all forms of discrimination everywhere? And it's like, can you imagine that world? And can you imagine how we get to that world in the next 15 years? So this is what we want, but I find it very difficult in my own mind to imagine being there. And if we can't imagine it, then it's very difficult to think, how do we actually get there? That's a very doom note I've just put on there.
I mean, so for instance, I was in Brazil, 7-8 days ago, and in Brazil, we looked at the question of affirmative action measures and the extent to which you can force change. Now, the argument that I would make is that the idea of just saying there is a legal equality is not good enough, because we've had that legal equality for, well, not quite centuries, but decades. But we have de facto inequality. So how do you get to that? And if you're hoping the market will determine this somehow, well, it's less likely to determine it. We seem to be in an age of populism that is going the other direction. So you've got to force it in some way. Who forces it then? And then that becomes, to what extent are women involved in that forcing process?
Yes. And how
even,
they are situated in
how are they located
often
in that
very
process?
uncomfortably.
Yeah.
or victimized or
You know,
these
but
poor women, they're not good enough really, but let's give them a helping hand.
Yeah. But then
Who wants
also,
to be that?
but even if you get the laws, unless you have police forces, judicial forces, and all the others who can enforce it in a meaningful way, but then women aren't present in those because of structural discrimination. So then you have all the enforcing agencies are still men.
But even if you put women in those positions, often they have to act like men in order to get on in those positions, and then you just reinforce it that way, and then people say, well, women are doing it now, and then it gets
the solution.
So then are you both saying that the only way is gradual? Because you're saying eliminating is not working.
No, we want patriarchal revolution tomorrow.
No, gradual.
Sign me up.
Multi-leveled. Let's say that
multi-leveled.
Yeah, it takes place in different layers of our society.
Thank you. Actually, that's an interesting discussion that we've come to. And while we're on this question of gradual versus completely eliminating, there is a little bit of a redefinition that has come on gender-based violence, which is that, and this is a question that has come in from Helen, who has posted it on the live chat. And she says that the definition is evolving to include, for example, gender non-binary. And this reinterpretation of gender-based violence, according to, is drawing attention away from violence against women and girls. Do we care to comment on that?
Interesting one. It's one of those that is actually one of those issues that does split women's movements and the feminist groupings on this one, about where you see the emphasis should be, because violence against women is still such an important issue, and it's so, the incidence prevalence is so high that you can see why you need to focus on that. But on the other hand, when you say women rather than gender-based violence, then you eliminate those people that are non-binary or trans or fluid gender identities, and that's really problematic, because that makes them even more invisible, and it makes it even more difficult for their voices to be heard. So my feeling is we need to do both, and we need to, I think, still go with violence against women in some context where it's very important, but on the other hand, to actually talk about the issue of violence against people that is gender-based violence because of their gendered identities and their fluidity of gender identity, or their chosen gender identity, non-conforming, and that should be a specific campaign around violence around that. That's my feeling. I don't know.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think, but gender still has a powerful political, can still be a powerful political tool, and for women as well. There's still a lot to be done in that respect, but yeah, a bit more inclusive as well, and not just.
But it's difficult bringing that change, and there's resistance, and I find it interesting, the resistance at all levels. The resistance within some women who are strong in women's movements and feminists that have resistance, also around trans and non-binary identities, and where they should be. If it should be women-only spaces, if we should be women-only groups, and that's it's a difficult conversation.
Very difficult, because even amongst groups who identify as non-binary, there's a reluctance to engage in a discussion on trans identity. So it's this. If we come down to the fact that what we should be doing within the society is respecting each person's own choice around their identity, and to live their life as they see it, as long as it doesn't harm anybody else, laws that harm anyone else, then in which case that's what we should be looking more around gendered identities. Maybe it's just queering the gender debate a bit more.
I mean, but the rule of thumb that I tend to find is useful is to think about two things really. One is context, and the other is inclusivity. So I think in addressing these ones, you've got to look first of all at context. If you are in a society where the vast amount of violence is occurring against women, call it that, and address that particular issue, and use it as a principle then to just eliminate violence. So we don't need violence of any kind against anybody on any basis, as far as I'm concerned. So there's no reason why you should exclude anyone from that particular.
Well, Magali and I have got double.
So I think, but one of them is context. You need to understand the context in that particular society, especially if you're trying to combat change, because you use the wrong strategy there and you could end up not paying attention and undoing some good work. And the other, I think, is the inclusivity principle, that you need to make sure that there's as much emphasis on ensuring, for me, the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. That is a fundamental principle for me. And if you start with that particular premise, then you need to look at that, anything that impacts the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. And it becomes our responsibility in society to, first of all, educate people about the importance of that, and then to ensure the do no harm principle. You had two big sides in the middle of my conversation.
I've sided Joshua before, so off you go.
I would agree with the principle that we should recognize violence in all its forms and against different groups, but I think there are specificities that we also need, and subjectivities experienced by women that need to be recognized, addressed.
Very specifically.
Very specifically. So, yeah, to talk violence at a general level. I mean, when we look at the number of deaths, if we go to deaths by violence, then obviously the majority are still young men who die violent deaths. And women, but I think women are now something like 30%. So with violence against women, at the same time, we've got these laws that say it's wrong and it's illegal and all the rest of it. We've got more extreme forms of violence against women as well, on one hand. And then on the other hand, we've got groups that are being invisibilized because of the way that the violence discourse is being put forward. But I don't think going on a general discourse is a solution, nor going, which is the biggest group that is suffering violence, because if we look, say, in many countries, that would be young men who die most from violence compared to women who live violence on a daily level and live violence in a very different way, either in the home, which is invisibilized on a daily basis through bullying, through harassment, through unwanted touching, which then is very different from from who are the people that have the most violence in that which is the experience of violence of those people.
While we're at this, there's actually been a question that has come. There's a question that's come in, which says that how do we develop a gender-inclusive vocabulary for hegemonic ideologies? And I thought that this can actually link very nicely to a greater question on sexual identities and the definition of gender. Where do we need to start to make sure that we recognize one, violence, then we look at gendered identities, and then we look at gender-based violence? I know this is a three-step question, but since we're discussing this anyways, I thought that let's just take a step back and we look at just the definitions and the idea of just the vocabulary that we're all familiar with.
I'm not so sure about my stance on discussing too much the linguistic aspect. I think sometimes we can get too caught up in I'm thinking more on discussions around identity and categorizing things. So I'm afraid that if I start thinking about, or if we start focusing too much on the vocabulary, we lose the importance of other issues, other fights that we need to have. That's just, I think it's not, I don't know.
I think if we go back to the reason why the notion of gender became popular, it became popular because it was about social constructions of gendered identities, and it was about the fact they can change, they're fluid. At the very basis of the why people took to gender was those two issues. It's a social construction and it's fluid. And if we think about that way, that gendered identities, all gendered identities, male and female, are social constructions, and they're fluid, they change over time, over space, and within one person. So actually, if we take gender like that, then it's perfect for the discussion.
Does that get us away from the binaries then?
It should do, but unfortunately, often when we talk gender, we're actually talking women. And
Yes.
I reread some of my own work. Someone asked me to write a chapter around masculinities post-disaster, and I said, I don't do men. And they said, well, Sarah, don't do men. And I reread some of the work I'd written post-Hurricane Mitch, and I was doing gender, but I was talking women, and I had women central, and then I had men as somehow oppositional. And when I had quotes from them, they were like, when they were disagreeing with their female partner. So I went back and I reanalyzed all the male interviews, trying to redress that and trying to think about it in a different way. Because when we say gender, then often we fall into those binaries. In fact, it is socially constructed and we do it.
Yeah.
And it's back to us, isn't it?
I mean, for sure, change. In terms of the legal framework, for sure, when we talk about gender, I think most of the legal frameworks are being politically correct. They mean women. And I think that's, again, you know, law is very much a kind of post facto. Society moves on, and then you hope law will catch up. And you know, and that it's rarely been a lead indicator. And I think that's one of the problems, that, you know, society moves on, and then you think, oh, let's change the laws now. You know, look at the extent to which rape in a marriage, for instance. How long did it take for the law to change on that? So, yeah, and so without a doubt, from the legal world, I would say, yes, it's crept in now that we're talking about gender, but by and large, it's women that the law is talking about. And I think this is a new challenge. This is a challenge in how we conceptualize our own work. And as Sarah is saying, you know, looking back on her own writings, that's something there. I think this is something that all of us need to rethink, because if you're in the name of exclusion excluding people, then it's a problem.
While we're on this wonderful topic, actually, I wanted to talk about something which is a common it's shop talk in India, and one is that how old is the queer identity, and is this debate on gender inclusivity and the language, the vocabulary, people's identities, is this a new debate? Because it's clearly not true when we look at the amount of literature that is there, and there's been plenty of, I mean, for example, in India, there's sacred texts that are being challenged on the account of heteronormativity. And of course, we look at how societies have been built just based on this gendered identity. So the question is that how difficult or uphill do you see this task? Do you see steady awareness and campaigning actually making a difference by 2030? Or do you think that, considering how long it has taken for us to actually have this as a table discussion, would that take many more centuries? I hope not. But what do the three of you think?
The crystal ball tell you on this.
I'm not too sure on that. My predictions here. Well, I'm quite happy that at the moment it seems to be quite more prominently on the table. It is obviously overlooking certain groups, certain voices, but it's
out there.
It's out there, maybe. But what else going to be done after that? What kind of impact it will have? That's, you know, how it's going to be followed.
I think at the moment it's refreshing that so much is being talked about, and seemingly things are being done, but on an individual basis and often high profile, so we see about them. My concern is, how will that change on a day-to-day practice? But I do have some optimism, because again, when I've had conversations in the classroom, you know, and men and now students have started asking, well, you know, what happens if this happens in the tube and if I accidentally do that? But then, you know, you should be able to tell when it's an accident or not. But at least those conversations are started.
Yes.
But
the conversation are just starting. I did the gender pay gap statistics session this week, and it was to the utter surprise. So we did it against categories in the UK. So it can go up to 28% difference for certain professions in the finance sector. But on average, I'd say it's around 20%. But it was still a big surprise for my
and I think
women.
I think that this hashtag #MeToo hashtag, then there's a lot of men who have gone, well, I'm really surprised about all these women saying that they're harassed all the time. How surprising! And all women are going, yeah. So you've got that going on as well. And how then do we move forward on that? And how do you know?
I mean, surely one of the things that has to be the first step anyway is awareness. I think we've hit that particular criteria. Not
Mm-hmm.
even that has been hit widely enough. But I mean,
yes.
but traditionally, I think it's the same with any of the goals really that are in the Sustainable Development Goals. We're asking for radical changes of behavior. That's what all of the goals are asking for: radical changes of behavior. The extent to which the goals can be achieved depends on how quickly we can, first of all, make everybody aware of how radical the change in behavior is necessary, and then how we can implement it.
Mm.
Now, even if we get 100% coverage on awareness between now and 2030, that still won't change a lot. It'll change something, but it won't change a lot. The question is, can we get that awareness really quickly? And then can we move to implementation? I think the challenges are different. But I keep saying to people, if you keep assuming the future will resemble the past, it will. If you want to create a different future, you have to imagine it. You have to start, first of all, making people aware of it. You need to start listening to how other people can imagine it. And then you need to start trying to implement it. But we don't do that. We just assume that the future will look like the past. And then, of course, it will.
No, but I think also that I think we're back to the issue of power. Because if you are in a subordinate position, it's very difficult to think about how you can change it. If you're oppressed, then to understand your own oppression and to act to change that oppression is very difficult. So you've got the whole issue of power coming back in, and who has the power and who's holding the power, and then the discourse comes from those with the power as well, directing that change. So if you look at climate change, we can see that. So it's not just on gender, and if we look at climate change, we need radical change in behaviour. But of course, what's blocking that is not just individuals can change their behaviour, but the big, powerful nations and companies. They're not capitalist structure, so capitalism and patriarchy coming in together again, and therefore we've got to look at those big power structures. And envisioning change in that way is quite.
And admittedly, in the discussions that we have now, and it's coming up in various discussion boards. I think it was Barbara Ehrenreich who's written a number of books on, and just really concerned about the fact that the hashtag #MeToo was also very much middle class woman. So it's been very good in highlighting different stories, and but it's very classed as well.
Very.
So she's arguing, what about all the issues around sexual harassment of women who work as hotel keepers or waitresses, and they're working class professions that don't have the same kind of prominence as what we have now.
And those people who don't have access to the internet or are denied access to the internet because of patriarchal control within the home. So, we've got all those voices that are silent and now silenced.
Yes.
Magali, would you be able to share this article with us? It would be wonderful if we could post it on the forum.
Yes, we'll do. Yeah, it's an interview that she's given on.
Okay. Actually, while we're discussing the Me Too campaign and while we're discussing voices that were unheard and now being spoken to, this is something I think is connected back to the culture question, which is that here in India and South Asian societies, there is a notion of shame in terms of that a woman can bring shame. There's shame politics. It's a rhetoric that is constantly repeated. And it was interesting that when we saw some of the discussions that came off the Me Too campaign, many people said that even while there was recourse to this available, they did not say this because they were afraid of the consequences just in day-to-day behavior in normal society. Do you think that the politics of shame would require something much more than a legal remedy? And what do we need, that violent or that massive change which can only come from revolution to actually alter this?
Well, I can go first and say everything needs much more than legal.
No, but I mean, everybody agrees. It's, illegal, you can set the rules, but that doesn't mean change behaviors.
I think the issue of shame is, I think that's also, I mean, obviously in India, that's very, culture, that's the way it's being used, at least, is very specific. But I think it very much came out in the Me Too postings were very much how people felt ashamed, and women felt ashamed themselves, and that's why they didn't talk out about it, because they felt the shame of actually having had that happen to them.
And women who did come out in the past have been shamed. Yes.
Yeah. Shame.
And so not in the same way, maybe in relation to honor, but it's not a process of change that happens.
Yeah, I think if we think put the shame notion in a broader sense, then we can see much more links, and we can see then maybe a way of working through that, because there is this whole culture of it on many different levels, not just in the way that we often see it. But yes, I think the Me Too campaign really did bring that out, the feeling ashamed issue, and which is really very interesting if you have a violent act against you and then you feel ashamed of that.
Yes.
I mean, when you
victim shaming, exactly. Why does the victim face that shame?
And how we got to a society where that can be the case. And we talk survivors, but when you talk to survivors, and that's a language we should use, obviously, but so many of them still feel victims. And we should say us, because I mean, if we look at Me Too, then most women, I don't know any of my female friends who hasn't had some incident at some time. And we were talking earlier, wasn't I? One of the things that was really interesting, the age. I remember the first time that I can think of that was when I was in junior school. And certainly when I got to secondary school and was going out, men would make comments if I had a short skirt on walking down the street. And it was seen to be quite, quite acceptable. You know, people say you can't go out. You can't go out.
Wow, somebody's phone is ringing. Can we? Apologies there to everybody who suddenly was confused.
So yeah, the age.
We almost got Rebecca on stage.
We nearly got Rebecca on stage. She just managed to get her on.
So the age is.
Yeah, I think the young age at which you start to internalize women and others who face this
as a threshold of acceptability.
Yeah, as you start to normalize it, normalize and internalize. It's shocking.
But the shame, I mean, stigma around. For how long have we had stigma around rape victims coming forward, having to have in-camera proceedings and things like that?
For why?
Yeah.
But then with rape, it always comes down to consent. It's difficult to. But then the campaign has been, well, if people don't say yes, then it's a no.
Yeah. Exactly.
You know, it shouldn't be you have to say no. It should be that you say, if you don't say yes, it is no.
But you know, the shame in the kind of international human rights law world, we've had this debate for a long time about whether naming and shaming works. And the argument is, you can't compel a state to change its behavior. What you can do is encourage, cajole, persuade. You can do all of these things short of, what do? Do you send in an army because the state's not fulfilling its human rights obligations? Even if you could, whose army would we be sending? And who would determine when that threshold had been met? So this is the difficulty with it. And so for a long time, we talked about naming and shaming, and actually some states are just shameless.
But Joshua, while we're on this, let's look at the people who have made accusations against powerful people in Hollywood, such as Harvey Weinstein or Kevin Spacey. Naming the perpetrators, it seems to have made a difference. Can we draw that example and say that perpetrators of sexual violence against any age group, against any gender, and especially people who are misusing and abusing their power, is that a first step? Is that an easy to see, definite, recognized first step? And should we, but because so many men can also be harassed and false allegations might be charged against them. So how do we balance this?
Yeah, it's in an article I read recently where they were talking about sexual harassment in academia, and I think there is some list going a bit undercurrent, and the argument was that it was a start, but probably the list was going to be slowly diffused.
This is a list of men who are known to be a bit touchy. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
informally, that is. No, this is we're talking academia.
But isn't it the only way in which you start by saying, and then yes, the onus will fall and people may be wrongly accused, and then the burden changes.
But it's the way you started, because if the list is underground, which it has been for years, people say, "Oh, be careful when you go into that professor's office," because that's what he's like, and so yes, it keeps it again internalized and normalized. Yes. So that's the problem. But then the powerful figures is interesting because they get people's awareness, or they make people read the newspaper or think about it. But they can also take away from the fact that it's not always men in power that are harassing women. It's a power over issue.
Yes.
And that can be any man.
Yes.
Or any woman or man. And you know, it's that whole issue. We're back to power.
Again, a more diffuse understanding of power, which can take.
But surely you'd agree that, I mean, it's in a sense the rolling of the head of Harry Weinstein on this issue suggests that now other people can be tackled. If you didn't have it, if it was a lower level, if it was a man who was not in power, it was not likely to make the headlines. It was not likely to be interesting, and those tend to be individual cases by women who are brave enough, have the conviction enough to make the case and deal with the consequences.
Absolutely.
When you hit somebody like that, then it starts churning this thing, and isn't that a good thing?
It's a good thing, but I think sorry. I think it's important not to get too hooked up on it's men in power.
Yeah, sure.
You've got to accept that it's possible
more mundane.
all men, all women. It's much more mundane. It's much more day to day, everyday sexism. Hashtag also on that one. And also, we've also got to look at the way that some of these men who have been accused apologise very well, and therefore it was diffused, and then others apologised very badly.
Yeah, the tone of the apology.
But the tone of the apology was so good, and then it was like, oh, hasn't he? You know, he's remorse, and he's going to go off and get treatment, and that's what I mean by it's going back on the man. That's going, oh, I'm so sorry, and suddenly the tension's there rather than.
What's with the get treatment stuff? I mean, how does
but
that
I
make
think
sense?
it's the depiction of the character. So the media picked up on that. It's become a caricature, which is taking away the whole discussion around sexual harassment. That should be much more beyond just simply having this monster-like character.
But
because
Magali,
it's not.
Why did we not have this kind of reaction with Dominic Strauss-Kahn a few years ago? What's the difference between that and
well,
and
we
Weinstein?
have a different category of women who spoke against a powerful man, and then that goes back to what I was saying earlier on, a class issue. So probably a race and class issue case where I mean it had an impact on it.
We should just remind our viewers who Dominic Strauss-Kahn was, because might not. You would say he was a leading contender to be the French president.
Absolutely, with a strong chance to be our next president. But he was the head of the English International
Monetary Fund,
IMF, and was accused of sexual violence against the hotel.
More than accused, I'd say. Convicted of.
Yeah, convicted. Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
I think in that sense that a lot of focus has been on the social media and how it's taken off. But I think the press and the way the media have picked up on the Weinstein issue, it's because they can sell the newspapers with that one also. Because these are Hollywood stars, and therefore they've got that glamour, and people want to read the newspaper. I'm sounding very, very cynical here, but I mean it's obviously had some really positive effects, which is excellent. But I think I don't know that the newspapers who wrote the stories necessarily were looking to let's start a patriarchal revolution.
They haven't been listening to Sarah enough. That's the problem.
No, actually, I remember. I'm sorry, we just have about 5 more minutes. But actually, I remember that when the Dominic Strauss-Kahn case came up, I remember the victim was from Guinea, and that had an interesting dynamic, which was that the former colonizer. The person who was the perpetrator was the former colonizer of the country that she came from. And once again, I think there's just this discussion that is constant with a power dynamic. And it's so interesting to hear these comments about who is the victim, who is the perpetrator, and how that affects the story. I think all of us have a little bit more aware about that. And I think that's something that is a very important takeaway of this discussion today. I would like to just give 5 minutes to all of you to just concluding comments, please. Any something that you would really like to share this to just end this discussion.
Guys, I'll just telling us that's it. Who wants to go first?
I don't mind. I wanted to say actually in the context of the power and issue. We had, for instance, and we lived through many years of Berlusconi rule, and Berlusconi rule almost made it a virtue. to treat women as objects and not subjects. We live now in an era where Trump has won the presidency of the United States of America, despite treating women as objects and not subjects. So this power dynamic, I think, is a central feature to it. And we should savor the victories over the likes of the Weinstein issue, but there are so many defeats at the highest level where not only is it accepted, the mundane is accepted on a daily basis, but actually the dramatic is glorified. So the distance we have to cover is so enormous to be able to even get that awareness there. So anything that contributes to that awareness has got to be a good thing, but just let's not lose sight of the distance that has to be covered on this one.
It needs to be picked up.
Absolutely. Magali, please.
Yes, just to say, for me, I think it's very important that sexual harassment is on the table to debate and on with, but maybe thinking beyond just simply sexual harassment, but harassment and the question of gender. So just expanding the debate on different forms of discrimination, would be also interesting to be put on.
So very much around gender-based bullying and harassment.
Yeah, more
and
broadly.
I think we need to go this more broadly. And I think what's come out of the discussion is very much that this is an issue of power, and that violence is about power. And it's about power over, and it's about control. In this case, very much within the patriarchal framework. And I think we really do need to start talking power and really bring it on the table. Rights are nice, but let's go. Laws are nice, but let's go talk power and these power imbalances, and then maybe.
Knowledge and everything.
And on that note, we have some themes to explore for the next webinar. I would just like to remind all the participants and the students of our course that the next week is a reading week. So you do have an entire week to catch up on modules 1 to 5. If you have any friends, if you have anybody who would like to join this course, it's not too late to enroll. Please sign up. You can catch up on all the wonderful discussions, some excellent chapters and material. And please stay tuned for more. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Magali. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you as always.
Thank you, Chideshri.